So most economists' favorite response to externalities is taxation. So if the externality is harmful, tax the activity. If it's beneficial, subsidize it. This is a simple solution that directly creates prices for an activity. But notice that the tax must be the marginal externality at the optimal level of the activity, right? Because that's what causes, on the margin, the right things to be taken into account. Otherwise, it doesn't play the same role as price. However, imagine that we are currently at a bad level of an activity, and we're trying to get to the right level of activity. And imagine what we do is we just impose the price which is equal to the marginal externality if we did reach the right level of the activity. Camilo Ramirez, is Camilo here? Does anyone else want to try to explain why that might not work so well as a policy approach? Yeah, go ahead.
If you look like at the shape, you could get a local maximum. So get here and like up.
Yeah, exactly. So, sorry, we didn't discuss this last week, but imagine that you're in a situation where we have a product which the more that people use it, the more people want to use it, right? We'll talk more about products like that in the future, but you can imagine Facebook's one example of that, right? Imagine that Facebook were to just, rather than making it free, they charge something for it, but they want to get up to their critical mass, so they just give a little subsidy which is equal to the value that people add when we have the whole Facebook system set up, right? That could be a real disaster. Why? Because people don't value it unless everyone's already on it, right? So it often makes a lot of sense for Facebook or for other internet companies to give a subsidy which is not based on the value that people bring to others at the optimal level, but which gets us up to that optimal level, right? By giving a lot of subsidy early on and then gradually reducing the subsidy as we get up to the optimal level, right? And this is something you see all the time in internet businesses. All the internet businesses, almost all, are totally free and have no advertising early on until they build up a critical mass of people who can interact with one another, and then they start charging for the service or having advertisement, right? And the reason is that they don't just want to, give a subsidy for the externality that people cause at the optimum. They want to give a subsidy that will cause us to get to that optimum by ensuring people that even if there aren't so many people on the platform, they'll do better. And we'll talk a little bit more about this concept, which is called an insulating tariff, later. Okay. Now, the most practical, common practical application of taxes is taxes for pollution. So let me give you some examples of those. One is effluent taxes by inspection. So the current way that we usually regulate vehicles is we require everyone to have certain levels of clean technology in their vehicles so they don't pollute. But an alternative proposed by this guy Lawrence White was that your car would be inspected every so often, and based on how much pollution it was actually letting off, you would be taxed based on where you lived and where you drove, because pollution is not so harmful out in the countryside. It's very harmful in the city, right? Another example is the French government has a whole raft of taxes. They have a whole book full of taxes you pay for every type of chemical that comes out of your factory. Carbon taxes are another example. So, sorry, we won't talk more about that on Thursday. We'll use that. We'll talk about that more in a moment. These are used a lot in Europe right now and are proposed to be used throughout the world to deal with the climate change effects of carbon. Now, most economists prefer to have this sort of taxation over direct regulation. And Sebastian, why is that true? Yeah.
And then you can feel the power of what kind of.
But why not just directly regulate the factories to make them all, you know, produce the right level of pollution?
Federal price tax you pay for pollution.
Yeah, but why is that better?
Well, I'm not sure if it's better or not. I think they do both things. They put the price and they also put regulations on what you can.
But most economists think the price is better. Why do most economists think that?
The regulation might be somehow efficient, as you need to measure exactly where, at what point you need to regulate, and determine that is quite difficult.
Yeah, so that's definitely getting at the basic thing. I mean, I think the reason is that basically regulation doesn't target the key issue. The key issue is how much are you polluting? The key issue is not did you pollute above or below this amount. We try to create a price on exactly the thing that's harmful, not on something that's related to it. Because some people might be more efficient at reducing pollution than other people are. And the tax allows them, if it's cheap for them to reduce it, to reduce it. If it's expensive, not to reduce it, right? Because you target sort of the key issue. So to give an example of that, Meredith Fowley and co-authors recently did a study about ways of reducing pollution by nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is a pollutant that's poisonous and can cause acid rain and so forth. And in the US, primarily what's done is that they put caps on the amount of nitrous oxide that factories can produce. But they put no regulations on cars. So cars don't have to pay anything for all the nitrous oxide they let out. And that sort of specific regulation that didn't get at the key issue is very costly. And the reason is they calculated the cost to the factories of decreasing their emissions as a function of how much you made them decrease their emissions. And they got like a supply curve like this. And then this line is the cost of reducing emissions using cars. And the point is that at the current regulation level, we have factories reducing their emissions by this amount. And we could gain this amount here, $2 billion, if instead we had the same price for everyone, because then the cars for whom it was cheap would reduce their emissions, and only the factories that could reduce emissions more cheaply than cars would reduce the emissions that way. Okay. So in the US, many Pigouvian taxes, if not most, are not collected through taxation. They're collected through the legal system. In particular, when a firm or an individual causes harm to someone else, they get sued, and the court assesses how much harm was caused, and the individual has to pay for the harm. In particular, they pay what are called compensatory damages, which directly redress the harm that was caused. And they can also pay punitive damages to deal with the fact that not every time I cause a harm to someone else, I end up getting caught. Given that it's uncertain whether I get caught or not, it makes sense to multiply my damages by something to take into account all the times that I didn't get caught. And not all these punitive damages get paid to the person who brings the lawsuit. Some of them get paid to the state. And the reason is, if you paid them to the plaintiff who brought the suit, then they would have an incentive to actually put themselves in the way of the harm that was being caused in order to make this extra money, right? Okay. So what this says is that the Anglo-Saxon legal system, which has all these lawsuits and so forth, incorporates these basic Pigouvian principles. Basically, not everything can be covered in statutes. The courts deal with a lot of things. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of people, especially on the right wing in the United States, are very critical of all these lawsuits. They call them frivolous lawsuits and so forth. But the thing to notice is that in Europe, where there's a lot less lawsuits, the reason is that they operate much less on this payments in accordance with product principle, which is a very market-oriented principle, and much more on the principle of prohibiting and regulating specific things that people do. And so despite the complaints that everyone has about all the lawsuits in the United States, in some sense that's a natural outgrowth of the fact that it's a more market-oriented system. Rather than regulating everything, we make people bear the consequences of their actions. And so really this litigiousness that the right's opposed to in the United States is actually the foundation of a lot of the free market systems that exist there. Okay. Now the Europeans have a different perspective. They think we should directly control behavior more. But in some sense, the US system also incorporates sort of a spectrum. So there's two different systems that are used to determine liability in the Anglo-Saxon system. One is called strict liability, where whatever is the consequence of your action, you're forced to pay. But a more common system is ones based on negligence, where you didn't do all the things you reasonably could have been expected to do in order to avoid harm. And the reason, I would argue, why that system often prevails over the stricter liability system is that people couldn't be expected to pay all the consequences of their actions necessarily. And if they did, that could end up causing really big risk for people because they don't know exactly what it's what's going to be the effect. So a very classic example of this is that there was this case where a woman was getting onto a train, and she was holding a box. And the guy sort of helped her onto the train in sort of a rough way. And in the process, the box fell to the ground. Now, it turns out the box was full of fireworks. And the fireworks went off when they hit the ground, and the whole train station burned down, and all sorts of people died. And the question is the guy helping the woman onto the train, maybe a little bit clumsily, responsible to pay all the costs of all the people who died as a result of him helping her on clumsily? And I think the answer that the Supreme Court came to was no, because it wasn't reasonable for him to have expected that being slightly clumsy with this box would have led to this terrible outcome, right? So similar things happen in malpractice for doctors. Doctors are not required to just pay for whatever the outcomes of their patients are. Instead, they're required to take due care and to act sort of in a reasonable, non-negligent way with their patients. This is, otherwise, doctors would have a really huge source of risk, which private insurance helps solve, but might not completely solve. Okay. So even in the United States, even when there's more emphasis on payments in accordance with product, these notions of negligence end up more directly controlling behavior than you might think in the most abstract sense. Okay. So an alternative to having a tax is to have what's called cap and trade, where there's a cap put on the total amount of an activity that takes place, and then you allow people to trade the rights to that to whoever it's most efficient. And Gabrielle, why does that system lead to the same type of an outcome as putting a price on something? Does anyone else want to try to explain that? Yeah, go ahead. You're again, Roman. Yeah.
Because you don't restrict the quantities, and the outcome is going to be the same as if I raise the price or if I put it back to the price.
Exactly right. So if you put let's think about a simple case. Imagine we put a maximum on pollution, and then we auctioned off the rights to the pollution, right? Then basically there would be some equilibrium price in that auction. And that equilibrium price would exactly be some price that we could have put as a tax, right? The equilibrium price in the auction is the same as the level of the tax. So if we know the demand, and so therefore we know the price at which the auction will clear, these things are completely equivalent to one another. So for most intents and purposes, these are exactly equivalent. However, this cap and trade system is often proposed for political purposes instead of the auction system. And can anyone explain why that might be the case? Well, when we raise a tax, if we give money out to people, it's really obvious that we're giving money to people, right? So imagine we put a tax on something, and then we take the revenue that we raise it, and we give it to a bunch of companies. Everyone would scream, oh, you're giving money away to these big evil companies, right? But on the other hand, if you allocate to them the right to pollute, and then they can sell that to someone else, somehow there it seems like you're not giving them money. You're giving them the right to pollute. But of course, the right to pollute is equivalent to money if you can trade it, right? And so it's sort of a backdoor way of giving subsidies if you use this cap and trade system, right? So it's often used to buy off political support for these types of proposals, because it doesn't look as much like a blatant giveaway. But let's put aside this political logic and try to think whether there's an economic logic favoring putting a cap rather than having a price. And the basic trade-off here comes from a paper by Marty Weitzman. And his argument is that when you make a decision about a cap or a price or a tax, that is not just for this moment. It's going to last for a few years, right? It's going to be over some time period. And over that time period, you may not know what the demand's actually going to be over that period, right? So the demand might be higher than you expect. It might be lower than you expect. So let's think about how that might impact whether you want to use a price or a quantity. Because if you're uncertain about the demand, they're not going to be equivalent to one another. Okay, so let's let the marginal private value of an activity be equal to P star. So marginal private value is sort of like the inverse of the excess demand function. It's like how much is it worth to society on net to do a bit more of this activity if the current amount that's being done is Q, right? Let's let that be P star minus A times Q minus Q star minus epsilon, where P star and Q star are some fixed constants. A is a fixed constant, and epsilon is some unknown thing that could move around the private value of the activity. So this is basically a linear social demand for the activity curve that's decreasing. On the other hand, let's let the marginal social cost be P star plus B times Q minus Q star, where B is, again, a known constant. P star and Q star are as before. Notice that I introduced uncertainty in the marginal private value and not in the marginal social cost. The reason is that the uncertainty in the marginal social cost doesn't make any difference for the difference between price and quantity. And you can pretty easily show that using a technique similar to what I'm about to develop. But just to reduce the math, I left that out. OK. Now, let's notice that the socially optimal quantity is going to equate the marginal private value and the marginal social cost. And that would give us the optimal quantity Q double star is equal to Q star plus A over A plus B times epsilon. You guys can just try doing out the algebra. I also gave a course note that does the algebra. OK. Now, what is the dead weight loss associated with not doing Q star, but instead doing something else Q? Well, it's the Harburger triangle between the socially optimal thing and the relevant level, right? Let me just draw that on the board. So imagine here's the marginal private value, MPV, PV. Here's the marginal social cost. This is the optimum. Imagine that instead we have this quantity here, right? Then what's the social loss from that? Well, it's this triangle here, right? Now this line here has a slope of A. This one has a slope of B, right? And this distance here is Q minus Q star star. So it's easy to calculate that the distance of the bottom of this triangle is A plus B times Q minus Q star star. And so the whole area of the triangle is Q minus Q star star squared times A plus B divided by 2. Right? So notice that this is quadratic in Q. So what that says is that we want to make Q as close as we possibly can to Q star star. Right? That's pretty intuitive. Now, suppose that we impose a price, P star. Turns out that it's pretty easy to see that that would be the optimal price. Well, then if we solve P star equals this, the market will choose the point where the marginal private value is equal to the tax that we put on, right? So if we choose P star equals this, the P stars cancel out, and you get that Q is equal to Q star plus epsilon. On the other hand, if we set an optimal quantity at Q star, then the quantity will always be Q star. So in the first case, the difference between that and the optimum is going to be epsilon minus A over A plus B times epsilon. In the second case, it will be equal to exactly epsilon. Sorry, it will be equal to A over A plus B times epsilon minus 0. Right? So which one of these is going to be closer, Sebastian? Okay, so with the price, what did we get? It was epsilon minus A over A plus B times epsilon was how far we were away. In the second case, we got that it was A over A plus B times epsilon. So which one is closer to 0? Which one gets us closer to the right level? Does anyone else? Try doing the computation, right? I said that in one case the distance was epsilon minus A over A plus B times epsilon. In the second case, the distance was A over A plus B times epsilon. So which one of those two things is greater? Well, let's Sebastian come up with it. What do you think?
Can you repeat the last part?
Okay, so if we choose price, right, does everyone agree the quantity is going to be equal to Q star plus epsilon? If we choose quantity, it's going to be Q star. The ideal is Q star plus A over A plus B times epsilon. Which is closer, Q star plus epsilon or Q star to Q star plus A over A plus B times epsilon? No. Does anyone else want to? Danielle, do you want to talk about it? Yeah, so let's do the math, right? Okay, how far is Q star plus epsilon from Q star plus A over A plus B times epsilon? Well, it's going to be Q star plus epsilon minus Q star plus A over A plus B times epsilon, which is B over A plus B times epsilon. What's the difference between A over A plus B times epsilon and Q star? It's A over A plus B times epsilon. Which one of those is bigger? Well, it depends on whether A or B is bigger, right? If B is bigger, the price is farther away. If A is bigger, the quantity is farther away. So we want to choose prices if A is bigger and quantities if B is bigger, right? And what that says is that if the private value is inelastic and the social cost is elastic, you should have a tax. So let me try to give a graphical version of this. So imagine that we have a marginal private value, which is very, very steep, like this. And we have a marginal social cost, which is very flat, like this. Now imagine the marginal private value, we're uncertain about it. So it could be here, it could be there, right? Now the social optimum would be right here and right here. But that looks awfully close to what would be done by a tax, which would put us right here and right here, right? Therefore, the deadweight loss associated with the tax is just these small triangles here. On the other hand, what about if we put a quantity control that was here? Well, that would lead us to choose this point and this point up here. Those are massively far away from the optimal levels, right? And would lead to a deadweight loss area that's this big here, right? On the other hand, imagine that we have a marginal social cost that is really, really steep and a marginal private value that's very shallow. Now, if we're uncertain about it, like this, the optimum would be these points, but that looks pretty darn similar to a quantity control. On the other hand, a price control here would lead us to choose these points that are way far away from the optimum, right? And this is pretty much common sense. I mean, imagine that we are in a world where if we go even a little bit over the right amount of carbon, the whole world blows up. You'd be crazy to put a tax on carbon. Because what if you turn out to be a little bit wrong? The whole world ends up blowing up, right? On the other hand, imagine that you're in a world where the private people are going to die if you put a little bit extra, if we don't have enough medicine available for people, right? There's a certain amount of people, imagine, who are incredibly, incredibly sick, right? We don't know exactly how many people are going to be incredibly sick. And now we put a quantity control on using antibiotics because it'll cause disease to adapt to the thing. That would be completely crazy to put a quantity control on antibiotics. Of course you want to put a tax on the use of antibiotics because you want to let it respond to how many people are actually sick, right? So this helps explain a lot of reasons why we use some systems for one thing and some systems for the other. So imagine you have sort of a local externality, something that only affects a local area. Well, you'd never want to put a nationwide cap and trade on that because the amount of harm that's caused by the local externality doesn't add up over the country. It's pretty much flat as a function of how many areas are doing the thing that causes the externality. So you'd almost certainly want to put a tax on that or have a tort system. That's why the court system ends up handling so many local externalities that we cause to each other. Because there's no sense in which it adds up across people, right? Similarly, smoking is an area where some people are really addicted to cigarettes, and it would be incredibly costly for them to quit. And so we put taxes on that rather than a global cap because the smoking doesn't add up too much across the country, and so it should be pretty flat costs, and the cost of mitigation can be really steep as some people are so addicted. On the other hand, if there's a very inelastic social value, very elastic private value, we tend to have cap and trade. For example, on highways, we don't tend to just have taxes for people who use the highway. We tend to say that you can't come on the road after some point, or at least a lot of people think that that would be the best system. We also do that for radio. We don't just have taxes for broadcasting on the radio. It congests so quickly that we just give the right to someone and then they can prohibit anyone else from getting in there. That's basically like putting a cap on it. And the reason is because congestion gets much worse beyond a certain point, right? So it doesn't make sense to have a tax on it. Similarly, lead in gasoline is sort of a similar thing. We say that you're just not allowed to have more than a certain amount of lead in the country or in your car. And the reason is because we know that the cost of getting rid of the lead is so constant. Okay. So, now all the solutions I've been talking about so far are basically public or government-led solutions. But some have suggested that you don't need to have public or government-led solutions to deal with externalities. So they've said that instead, you can just give property rights, and as long as property rights are clear, people will bargain to make things efficient. So for example, imagine that you live next to someone who makes a lot of noise, right? The efficient outcome is that they reduce their noise a little bit, but not totally, right? You don't want to force them to be completely silent, because that will make their life terrible. And you don't want them to be incredibly loud, because that doesn't add that much to them and detracts a lot from you. Now, imagine your neighbor has the right to make as much noise as he wants. Then you could pay him to shut off his noise, right? On the other hand, if you have the right to be quiet, for things to be quiet, then your neighbor could pay you for the noise that he makes, right? Either way, you reach effectively the same efficient bargain. So the question is, why is there any need for the government to get involved with this? And in fact, it's not even an issue of property rights, because the truth is someone always has a de facto property right. I mean, all that it means for someone to have a property right is that no one will stop them from doing it. No police will come in and stop them from doing it if they do something. So this says, shouldn't externalities always solve themselves? So the logic that I just gave is called Stigler's Coase theorem. And the reason that it's called Stigler's Coase theorem rather than the Coase theorem is because Coase didn't really believe that this was true. But Stigler, who heard Coase give the paper, did believe that it was true, and so promoted it a lot. So this says, if there are no quote-unquote transaction costs of bargaining, then efficiency will always result. If income effects are small, as we've been assuming, then the outcome that occurs will be independent of the assignment of property rights. Now, a natural question is, what is a transaction cost of bargaining? Juan Castillo, what do you think is meant by a transaction cost of bargaining?
For example, the negotiation is complicated for both of them, and they take a lot of time to reach an agreement.
Yeah, so that's a transaction cost of bargaining. Can anyone else think of transaction costs of bargaining?
You need to pay lawyers for that bargaining to happen.
Yeah. Or you need to find the people who are causing the externality, or you don't know what the value of the other person is, or pretty much anything is a transaction cost of bargaining. Anything that gets in the way of efficiency is defined to be a transaction cost of bargaining. So in some sense, Stigler's Coase theorem is just a tautology. What it says is, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. Not that we live in the best of all possible worlds, but that if we did live in the best of all possible worlds, everything would be hunky-dory. So really, the Coase theorem doesn't say anything at all. But it is sort of a useful guide to intuition in some cases. So does anyone want to say when they think that bargaining might lead to efficiency? Well, one situation is when there's a very small number of people. So it's very easy for people to talk each other out. They all have to have the relevant information, right? Or at least more relevant information than governments or courts do. And they need to be able to find each other and know who each other are. Now, bargaining is often facilitated by a long-term relationship between people, because this lets us understand each other's situation, find each other easily, and so forth. And so in those situations, mergers between people are often a good way to deal with externalities. So one example of that is a condominium association. I don't know if anyone here bought or lived in a condo, but a condo is basically a case where actually you don't own the condo. You just have the right to live in the condo. The condominium association effectively owns the condo, and this causes, and everyone has to decide over things that cause externalities within the condo. And because they know each other well enough, this works pretty well. That's true for company towns as well. Cooperative firms are based on sort of the same principle, and so in some senses the EU. They sort of merge certain property rights, have certain common ownership. This helps them deal with externalities across the area. But mergers like this don't obviously always work. There's obviously always still conflicts within the firm and the organization, and they're not always good because they can be formed to deal with pecuniary externalities rather than real externalities. And in fact, that is very common when one side has a small number of players, so it's easy for them to merge, and the other side of the pecuniary externality, the people who get the downside or the upside of whatever this concentrated group gets the opposite side. And that is exactly what mergers between competing firms are, which is what we'll talk about next week. It's what industry-wide lobbying groups are, and the American Medical Association, like we talked about. Or if you want to talk about a case of pecuniary externalities related to these sexual things that we were talking about, men and women, you could think that a pack of popular girls in high school is sort of like that. They're one side of the externality. They gang together. They're all the most attractive girls tend to run together, and they sort of lord it over all the guys who now, because they're a colluding group, right? Okay, so despite its potential benefits, therefore, the Coase theorem is, I think, to a large extent misleading. And Nancy, why do you think the Coase theorem is misleading? Or what are some of the reasons why the Coase theorem is misleading?
Maybe it's not taking you to the right outcome, not necessarily. Maybe it's like try to negotiate with your neighbor, for example, it will get it.
Doesn't necessarily get you the right outcome, but why is it sort of even leading us in the opposite of the right direction? Does anyone else have thoughts about that? Well, one reason is that notice that all the Coase theorem says is we can bargain. But it doesn't matter where we start when we bargain. We'll always get to efficiency. So imagine we impose the Pigouvian tax and get things closer to the correct level. That can only make things better off. Because if it's inefficient, we can always rebargain to the efficient solution. So a Pigouvian tax can't possibly hurt and could help if the bargaining doesn't go so well. Right? Many externalities are extremely diffuse. They affect tons of people. And it's almost going to be completely impossible to find all the people and have them all bargain together. How could we ever have people bargain over the effects of climate change? We're going to get every person who's affected by the change in the climate together into a single room, and they're going to somehow find a way to negotiate over the solution. And more importantly, the relevant information is usually diffuse. So even to know what the right solution is to the climate change problem requires information from tons of people. How are we going to get that all together? Okay, so at best, bargaining is only as good as the information that the relevant parties have about who else is causing the effect and about what the right solution to the problem is. So the real question to ask is not, isn't it possible for bargaining to solve this, but rather, who are the relevant people who know best how to address the market failure that exists? And the Coase theorem says little, if anything, against intervention. All it says is that if you were able to bargain, that could also solve the problem. Okay. So the real problem, therefore, in dealing with all externality issues is finding the right information. And this is the theme of not our next class, but what we're going to do in 5 minutes. So typically, information is diffused, but there's also some expertise that's available to judge things. Scientific and technical expertise, and we'll talk about the Stern review and epidemiological analysis, and how to combine that with economic thinking. Usually this is carried over for other areas of economic thinking, such as the value of the human life. Second, private and subjective value that's held by individuals throughout the economy can also be valuable. And this can be important in many contexts, but hard to extract from people, and we'll talk about the difficulties of that. A simple approach is to just survey people about how much they value something, but we'll see that that can be very sensitive to strategizing. And I'll talk about an example about Haiti from The Economist magazine. But on the other hand, incentive-compatible mechanisms that get people to actually reveal how much harm is caused to them can be very difficult. So the basic problem of dealing with externality policy is how to combine scientific expertise with this difficult to extract value from individuals to make the right decisions about externality policy. Okay. And let's take a 5-minute break there.